When Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez rose from her seat in the House Oversight Committee and declared Ben Shapiro a threat to American democracy, she believed she had struck the decisive blow. She had rehearsed this moment, workshopped it with her communications team, practiced the cadence and the pauses in front of mirrors. She knew the cameras were recording from every angle, knew that within minutes the clip would be trending across Twitter and Instagram, knew that her supporters would celebrate her courage in speaking truth to power. What she didn't anticipate, what her bubble of sycophants and yes-men hadn't prepared her for, was that Ben Shapiro had been waiting for exactly this moment. He sat in the third row of the gallery, yellow legal pad balanced on his knee, pen moving steadily as she spoke, that small knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. To anyone who understood how Shapiro operated, that smile was a warning sign, a signal that the trap had been set and the prey was walking willingly into it. For the next 42 minutes, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez would learn a brutal lesson about the difference between social media popularity and actual substance, between performative outrage and documented facts, between building a brand and building a record. When it was over, when Shapiro had methodically dismantled every pillar of her political identity using nothing but her own words and her own decisions, AOC would sit at that witness table unable to defend herself, unable to explain away the mountain of evidence, unable to do anything except watch as the career she had built on rhetoric crumbled under the weight of reality. The House Oversight Committee hearing room on November 3, 2025, was packed to capacity and beyond, bodies pressed into every available space, the air thick with anticipation and barely suppressed excitement. This was not scheduled to be a particularly newsworthy hearing. The official topic was social media regulation and congressional ethics, dry policy matters that would normally attract maybe a dozen reporters and a handful of interested observers. But word had leaked that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez would be testifying, and where AOC went, cameras followed, drama ensued, and viral moments materialized. The left side of the gallery was filled with young progressives, many wearing clothing emblazoned with squad merchandise, Bernie Sanders campaign memorabilia, and various social justice slogans. They clutched their smartphones like weapons, already positioned at optimal angles to capture whatever quotable moment their champion would deliver. These were the true believers, the ones who had turned AOC from a congresswoman into an icon, who saw in her not just a politician but a revolutionary, a voice for their generation, proof that the system could be changed from within. The right side of the gallery held a different crowd, conservative media figures, Republican staffers, political observers who had come not to celebrate but to witness. There was an electricity in their section too, but it was the anticipation of hunters who had caught scent of wounded prey. And there, in the third row, sat Ben Shapiro. At 39 years old, he had built a conservative media empire on a foundation of what he called facts and logic, a rhetorical style that involved speaking at machine gun pace, overwhelming opponents with data and citations, maintaining absolute calm while everyone around him lost their composure. He wore a dark suit that had probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, his yarmulke perfectly positioned, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the harsh overhead lighting. The yellow legal pad on his knee was already half filled with notes, observations, questions he planned to ask, points he intended to make. Most people who saw him sitting there, quietly scribbling away, would have assumed he was just another observer, another journalist capturing testimony for later commentary. They would have been wrong. Ben Shapiro was not there to observe. He was there to execute a plan that had been months in the making, a plan that required AOC to do exactly what her nature compelled her to do. Attack him personally, confidently, publicly, giving him the opening he needed to respond with everything he had compiled about her actual record, as opposed to her carefully curated image. Chairman James Comer of Kentucky called the hearing to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel, the sound cutting through the ambient noise and bringing a temporary silence to the chamber. He looked tired already, and the hearing hadn't even begun. Comer had been in Congress long enough to recognize when a hearing was going to spiral from policy discussion into political theater, and every instinct he had was screaming that today would be one of those days. Representative Ocasio-Cortez has been invited to provide testimony regarding social media misinformation and its impact on democratic institutions, Comer announced, his voice carrying the flat affect of someone reading words he knew were technically accurate but practically meaningless. The real reason AOC was here, the real purpose of this hearing, had nothing to do with the stated topic and everything to do with giving her a platform to grandstand, to perform, to remind America why she had become one of the most recognizable politicians in the country despite having passed virtually no significant legislation during her time in Congress. AOC stood up from her seat in the witness section with practiced grace, every movement calculated for maximum camera appeal. She wore a burgundy suit that had probably cost several $1,000s despite her socialist branding. Her hair styled in soft waves that looked effortless, but had likely required hours of professional attention. Her makeup applied with the precision of someone who understood that she wasn't just testifying to the committee, but performing for millions of viewers who would see clips of this moment, repeated endlessly across every platform. She approached the witness table with the confidence of someone who had never truly been challenged, never really been held accountable, never faced consequences for the gap between her rhetoric and her reality. "Thank you, Chairman Comer," she began, her voice carrying that particular blend of earnest concern and righteous anger that had become her signature. "I'm here today to discuss a crisis that threatens the very foundations of our democracy. The spread of disinformation through right-wing media outlets, the amplification of hatred and division by conservative commentators, the systematic undermining of truth itself by those who profit from chaos and fear." The progressive section of the gallery nodded along, some already typing furiously on their phones, live tweeting her opening remarks with approving commentary and fire emojis. This was the AOC they had come to see, the fearless fighter speaking truth to power, the voice of their generation refusing to be silenced by the establishment. She continued through several minutes of prepared remarks, hitting all the expected notes about media responsibility, the dangers of unchecked conservative messaging, the need for accountability from those who spread what she characterized as dangerous ideologies. It was fine, competent, the kind of testimony that would generate some approving headlines in friendly outlets and maybe a few viral clips for her social media channels. But then something shifted. AOC paused mid-sentence, her eyes scanning the gallery, and locked onto Ben Shapiro sitting there in the third row, still writing on his legal pad, still wearing that small knowing smile. Something about his presence, his calm, his apparent lack of concern about her testimony, triggered something in her. The prepared remarks were forgotten. The carefully scripted performance gave way to raw emotion, to the genuine anger and resentment she felt toward this man who represented everything she claimed to oppose. "And speaking of those who profit from spreading disinformation and hatred," she said, her voice taking on a harder edge, "we have Mr. Ben Shapiro here in this very room today." She pointed directly at him, and every camera in the chamber swiveled to capture his reaction. Shapiro looked up from his legal pad with an expression of mild interest, met her gaze for a brief moment, nodded once in polite acknowledgement, and then returned to his writing. The lack of visible reaction seemed to enrage her further. "Mr. Shapiro has built his career on spreading hatred," AOC continued, her voice rising, taking on the passionate intensity that her supporters loved and her critics mocked. "He attacks women, people of color, Muslims, LGBTQ Americans, anyone who doesn't fit into his narrow, bigoted worldview. He dresses up his prejudice in the language of logic and facts, but what he really does is give intellectual cover to the worst impulses of the right wing. He makes cruelty sound reasonable. He makes discrimination sound like discourse." The progressive gallery erupted in applause, standing ovations, shouts of support. This was the moment they had come for, their champion calling out one of the right's most prominent voices, refusing to let him sit there unchallenged while she spoke. Several people were filming Shapiro's reaction, hopping to capture him looking flustered or angry or defensive. They would be disappointed. Shapiro had not stopped writing. His expression had not changed. He appeared completely unmoved by the personal attack being broadcast to him and to millions of viewers. And if that wasn't infuriating enough for AOC, his apparent indifference, his refusal to give her the reaction she wanted, pushed her to go further. "You hide behind your credentials, Mr. Shapiro," she said, her finger still jabbing toward him. "You use your education and your debate tactics to confuse people, to make bad arguments sound sophisticated. But we see through you. We understand what you really are. You're not a journalist or a commentator. You're a propagandist. You exist to radicalize young men, to spread fear and hatred, to undermine the progressive policies that would actually help people." She was fully off script now, abandoning any pretense of discussing the stated hearing topic, instead launching into what was essentially a personal denunciation of someone who was sitting in the gallery as a private citizen. Several committee members looked uncomfortable. Chairman Comer appeared to be debating whether to intervene, but AOC was on a roll, carried forward by her own momentum and the encouragement of her supporters. "And as a Jewish man," she continued, crossing a line that even some of her allies would later acknowledge was a mistake, "you should know better. You should understand what it means to be targeted, to be othered, to face discrimination. Yet you align yourself with forces that promote exactly those things. You've chosen to be on the wrong side of history, Mr. Shapiro. You've chosen profit over principle, popularity over justice. You enable the very authoritarianism that your own people have suffered under throughout history." The room went completely silent. Even AOC's most ardent supporters recognized that invoking his Jewish identity while attacking him had crossed into territory that was at best inappropriate and at worst deeply offensive. But AOC, carried away by her own performance, by the cameras recording every word, by the applause still echoing in her ears, didn't seem to recognize the mistake. She stood there at the witness table, breathing hard from the exertion of her attack, looking at Shapiro with an expression of triumph, waiting for him to react, to defend himself, to give her the confrontation she had engineered. Shapiro finished writing whatever note he had been making, capped his pen with deliberate precision, and looked up. Their eyes met across the hearing room, and for a long moment neither spoke. Then Shapiro smiled, not a smirk or a sneer, but a genuine expression of something that looked almost like gratitude. He placed his pen carefully on top of his legal pad, folded his hands, and waited. Chairman Comer cleared his throat, the sound amplified by the microphone and cutting through the tension. "Representative Ocasio-Cortez, that was quite unexpected." He paused, consulting his notes with the air of someone who wished he had called in sick that morning. "Mr. Shapiro is actually scheduled to testify today as well. He's listed as an expert witness on media discourse and political commentary." The color drained from AOC's face so quickly it was visible even under her professionally applied makeup. She hadn't known. In her eagerness to attack Shapiro, in her confidence that he was just a member of the audience unable to respond, she had walked directly into a trap. Because now Shapiro wasn't just going to get the opportunity to respond to her attacks. He was going to get his own time at the witness table, his own microphone, his own platform to present whatever evidence he had prepared. And judging by the thickness of the folder he was now extracting from a leather briefcase that had been sitting at his feet, Ben Shapiro had prepared a lot. The progressive section of the gallery, which had been so jubilant moments before, now sat in uncertain silence, slowly realizing that something had gone very wrong with their champion's performance. The conservative section was trying to contain their anticipation, several people exchanging glances that clearly communicated they knew what was coming and could barely wait to see it unfold. Shapiro stood up with unhurried movements, gathered his legal pad and the thick folder, and walked toward the witness table with the calm confidence of a man who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. As he passed AOC, who was still technically a witness but now looked like she desperately wanted to flee, he nodded politely, even smiled slightly, a gesture of courtesy that somehow made the situation even more ominous. He sat down at the witness table, adjusted the microphone with practiced precision, and spent a moment organizing his materials, spreading documents across the surface with the careful attention of a surgeon laying out instruments before a complex operation. The room waited, the silence stretching, the tension building. Finally, Shapiro looked up, not at AOC but at the committee members, and when he spoke, His voice carried that distinctive rapid-fire delivery that had made him famous, words tumbling out at a pace that would be impossible to follow if not for his precise articulation. "Thank you, Chairman Comer, for the opportunity to testify today. Before I address the stated topic of this hearing, I need to respond to the personal attacks that Representative Ocasio-Cortez just leveled against me. She called me a propagandist, a spreader of hatred, an enabler of authoritarianism. She questioned my character, my integrity, and yes, my relationship with my Jewish faith. These are serious accusations, and they deserve serious responses. But unlike Representative Ocasio-Cortez, who just spent several minutes attacking me with nothing but rhetoric and emotion, I'm going to respond with something she seems fundamentally uncomfortable with: facts." He placed his hand on the thick folder in front of him. Documented, verifiable, undeniable facts about her record, her actions, her decisions, and the consequences of her time in office. Representative Ocasio-Cortez attacks me for being a right-wing propagandist. She suggests I spread hatred and division. She claims I enable authoritarianism. So let me ask a simple question. Who in this room has actual power? Who holds government authority? Who can vote on legislation that affects millions of lives? That would be her, not me. I'm a commentator. I express opinions that people are free to agree with or ignore. She's a member of Congress with real power over real people's lives. So if we're going to talk about who's dangerous, perhaps we should examine how she's used that power. Shapiro pulled the first document from his folder with the precision of a magician performing a well-rehearsed trick. Since Representative Ocasio-Cortez made this personal, since she decided to attack my character rather than debate ideas, let's examine her character. Let's look at her record. Let's discuss what she's actually accomplished during her time in office. He spread several pages across the table. In 6 years as a member of Congress, Representative Ocasio-Cortez has successfully passed exactly 0 significant pieces of legislation. 0. Not one bill she authored has become law despite her massive media presence and her claims to be fighting for working people. Meanwhile, she's become a multimillionaire. When she entered Congress, her financial disclosures showed a net worth of approximately $7,000. Today, she's worth over $2 million. $2 million in 6 years on a government salary of $174,000 per year. The math doesn't work through salary alone, so where did the money come from? Shapiro didn't wait for an answer. Book deals worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, Netflix documentaries, podcast sponsorships, speaking fees that reach $50,000 per appearance. She's monetized being Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the brand, the celebrity, the social media phenomenon. She's gotten rich from being famous for fighting capitalism while practicing capitalism better than most actual capitalists. The contradiction is so glaring, so obvious, that it would be funny if it wasn't tragic for the people who believed in her. He pulled out more documents, moving with methodical efficiency. But let's talk about how she enriched herself. Let's discuss Riley Roberts, her longtime boyfriend, now husband. Since 2018, Representative Ocasio-Cortez's campaign has paid Mr. Roberts over $6 million. $6 million in campaign funds for what the disclosures list as marketing and consulting services. So let me ask the obvious question, Shapiro continued, his delivery accelerating into that machine gun pace that made it nearly impossible to interrupt. What did Riley Roberts actually produce to justify $6 million in campaign payments? I had my research team do a comprehensive investigation. We looked for websites he built, campaign materials he designed, advertisements he created, strategic documents he produced, any tangible work product that would justify even a fraction of $6 million. The pause was perfectly timed, long enough for the question to hang in the air, short enough to maintain momentum. We found nothing. Absolutely nothing. No websites, no campaign materials, no advertisements, no strategy documents, no deliverable products of any kind. $6 million for work that apparently produced no results that can be identified or documented. That's not consulting. That's putting your boyfriend on the campaign payroll and calling it something official to make it sound legitimate. Shapiro looked directly at AOC for the first time since beginning his testimony. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, Can you name one specific thing Riley Roberts created that justified $6 million in campaign payments? Just one concrete deliverable. One website, one advertisement, one strategic document. Anything. AOC opened her mouth to respond, but Shapiro didn't give her the chance, continuing with relentless precision. You can't because there is nothing. You funneled $6 million of campaign contributions, money donated by people who believed in your message about fighting corruption and serving working people, to your boyfriend for undefined services that produced no identifiable results. That's not democratic socialism. That's corruption with better branding. He returned to his documents, pulling out what appeared to be campaign finance records. But it gets worse, because Riley Roberts isn't the only family member you've enriched through your campaign. Let's discuss Sunrise Communications, a company run by your chief of staff's family that received over $800,000 from your campaign for social media services during your first 2 years in office. Shapiro displayed the payment records, highlighted and annotated. $800,000 for social media management during a period when your actual social media engagement and follower growth was lower than the previous year. You paid $800,000 for social media services that produced worse results than you'd been getting for free through organic engagement. But the company was run by your chief of staff's family, so I guess the poor performance didn't matter as much as keeping money flowing to people in your inner circle. He moved to the next section of evidence without breaking stride. And let's not forget the campaign merchandise operation. Your campaign store, selling t-shirts and buttons and posters with revolutionary slogans about fighting the system, generated over $3 million in revenue. That's a $3 million merchandise business built on selling the image of fighting capitalism to people who apparently don't see the irony. The profit margins on that merchandise operation exceed 50%, meaning you've made over $1.5 million selling anti-capitalist merchandise at a markup that would make most corporations jealous. The Progressive Gallery had gone completely silent. These weren't vague accusations. These were specific numbers, specific payments, specific contradictions between AOC's image and her actual financial practices. Several of her supporters had started quietly gathering their belongings, unable to reconcile what they were hearing with the person they thought they had been supporting. Representative Ocasio-Cortez lives in a luxury apartment in Navy Yard that costs over $3,000 per month, Shapiro continued, pulling out real estate records. 24-hour concierge service, rooftop pool, private gym, wine bar. This is not how working-class people live. This is not how socialists live. This is how wealthy young professionals who have monetized a political brand live. But let's move beyond the personal corruption and discuss the policy failures, Shapiro said, transitioning smoothly to his next area of attack. Let's talk about the Amazon HQ2 deal and the 25,000 jobs Representative Ocasio-Cortez personally killed because it made her look revolutionary on social media. He pulled out printed tweets, AOC's own celebratory messages after Amazon canceled its plans to build a headquarters in Queens. In February 2019, Amazon announced it was canceling plans to build HQ2 in New York, eliminating 25,000 promised jobs with an average salary of $150,000. Representative Ocasio-Cortez celebrated this as a victory, claimed she defeated corporate greed, called it a win for working people. Let's examine what working people actually thought about losing 25,000 high-paying jobs. A man stood up in the conservative section of the gallery, wearing a union jacket with IBEW Local 3 clearly visible. Shapiro gestured toward him. "Sir, please tell the committee who you are and what the Amazon deal meant to you." The man approached a standing microphone positioned for public comment. "My name is Robert Chen. I'm a union electrician with Local 3 IBEW. I've lived in Queens my entire life, raised my family there, worked construction jobs throughout the city for 25 years. When Amazon announced HQ2, it represented the biggest economic development opportunity in Queens history. The construction phase alone would have employed over 1,000 union electricians for years. Good-paying union jobs with benefits and pensions. Work close to home, so I could see my family every night instead of commuting to Manhattan or Jersey for jobs. His voice grew harder. Then Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez killed it. She organized opposition, called Amazon corporate greed, pressured city officials until the deal fell apart. And when it died, when 25,000 jobs disappeared, she celebrated on Twitter while I lost the opportunity to work in my own neighborhood. Robert Chen pulled out applications from his jacket pocket, papers he had filled out months before Amazon canceled the deal. These are my applications for the HQ2 construction project. Useless now. Just paper. But they represented hope, represented the possibility of good work close to home, represented a chance to build something in my own community. Representative Ocasio-Cortez took that away, not because the jobs were bad or the pay was insufficient, but because opposing Amazon made her look good to her progressive followers. She sacrificed my livelihood for her image. He gestured to several other people in union jackets scattered throughout the gallery. We're all union workers from Queens. We all lost opportunities when Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez killed the Amazon deal. Electricians, plumbers, ironworkers, carpenters, thousands of union jobs destroyed so she could have a viral moment attacking a corporation. She doesn't represent working people. She represents herself. She uses working people as props for her social media content while actual working people suffer from her decisions. Robert Chen sat down to scattered applause from the conservative section, and notably, from several people who had been sitting in the progressive section, but who looked increasingly uncomfortable with what they were hearing. Shapiro didn't gloat or editorialize. He simply returned to his evidence. The Amazon deal would have generated 25,000 direct jobs and an estimated 40,000 indirect jobs in supporting businesses and services. It would have brought billions in investment to Queens, funded infrastructure improvements, created opportunities for small businesses to serve Amazon employees. Representative Ocasio-Cortez killed all of that. And for what? For Twitter clout. For the ability to say she stood up to a major corporation. For her brand as a revolutionary fighter against the system. But here's what she doesn't tell you, Shapiro continued, his pace never slowing. After Amazon pulled out, after the jobs disappeared, what happened to Queens? Unemployment increased. Business investment declined. The tax revenue that would have funded schools and infrastructure never materialized. Young professionals who would have moved to the area went elsewhere. Queens went from being the site of one of the biggest economic development projects in American history to being a cautionary tale about what happens when politicians prioritize performance over results. Shapiro pulled out economic data, employment figures, business development statistics. This is the real-world impact of Representative Ocasio-Cortez's decision to kill Amazon HQ2. 23% increase in unemployment in the neighborhoods that would have housed the headquarters. 41% decline in new business applications. 17% drop in commercial real estate values. Small businesses that had been preparing to expand in anticipation of Amazon employees canceled those plans. Restaurants that were going to open never did. Service businesses that would have thrived serving Amazon workers never materialized. She didn't just kill 25,000 jobs. She killed an entire economic ecosystem that would have lifted up working-class neighborhoods in Queens. And she did it for Instagram likes. A woman stood up in the gallery, this one from the progressive section, wearing a faded Ocasio 2018 campaign shirt. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of betrayal. My name is Jennifer Ramirez. I volunteered 60 hours a week for Representative Ocasio-Cortez's first campaign. I believed in her, believed she was different, believed she would actually fight for working people like she promised. I worked for free, completely unpaid, while juggling 3 part-time jobs to pay my rent because the campaign told us there was no money to pay volunteers. We were building a movement, they said. We were fighting corruption, they said. We were going to change the system from within. Jennifer's voice grew stronger, powered by anger that had clearly been building for years. Then I found out about Riley Roberts getting $6 million in campaign payments for work nobody can identify. I worked 60-hour weeks for free while her boyfriend collected millions. I sacrificed my health, my finances, my time, all because I believed she was different. But she's not different. She just has better social media. She used us, exploited our hope and our belief, turned our idealism into her profit. I want nothing to do with her anymore." Jennifer pulled the campaign shirt off over her head, revealing a tank top underneath, and threw the shirt toward the witness table. It landed in a crumpled heap red fabric against polished wood, a symbol of faith betrayed and idealism destroyed. Other young people in the progressive section began quietly leaving, unable to reconcile the person they had believed in with the reality being presented. Shapiro gave the moment appropriate respect, letting the testimony breathe before continuing. Jennifer Ramirez represents thousands of young people who believed in Representative Ocasio-Cortez, who worked for free while she enriched her inner circle, who sacrificed for a cause while she built a brand. That's not democratic socialism. That's exploitation with progressive aesthetics. He moved to his next section. But let's discuss the Green New Deal, the signature piece of legislation that Representative Ocasio-Cortez has built her entire political identity around. This supposedly revolutionary proposal that would transform the American economy, create millions of green jobs, save the planet from climate disaster. Let's examine what the Green New Deal has actually accomplished. Shapiro paused for dramatic effect. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Not one aspect of the Green New Deal has been implemented. Not one provision has become law. Not one job has been created. The Green New Deal exists only as a talking point, a brand, a way for Representative Ocasio-Cortez to position herself as a climate leader while accomplishing exactly zero actual climate policy. But she's made millions from it, Shapiro continued, pulling out book contracts and speaking fees. $400,000 advance for a book about the Green New Deal that has accomplished nothing. $50,000 per speech touring colleges to talk about climate policy that hasn't been implemented. Netflix documentary about her climate activism that produced zero actual policy results. She's monetized the Green New Deal better than any policy has ever been monetized, despite the fact that it's accomplished absolutely nothing in terms of actual environmental protection or job creation. He displayed economic analyses of what the Green New Deal would cost if actually implemented. Multiple independent analyses estimate the cost at between $50 and $93 trillion over 10 years. That's more than 3 times America's entire GDP. To put that in perspective, Representative Ocasio-Cortez is proposing to spend 3 times everything America produces in a year on a plan that even her own supporters admit has no realistic path to implementation. But facts and feasibility don't matter when you're building a brand, when you're creating content, when you're monetizing climate anxiety. Shapiro pulled out constituent service records, public data from congressional offices. But perhaps most damning is how Representative Ocasio-Cortez has abandoned the basic responsibilities of being a member of Congress while building her celebrity brand. These are constituent response rates from all congressional offices. The average member of Congress responds to constituent inquiries within 3 days. Representative Ocasio-Cortez's office averages 6 weeks. 6 weeks versus 3 days. Why? Because responding to constituents doesn't generate social media content. It doesn't build her brand. It doesn't make her famous, so she doesn't do it. A man in his 50s stood up, clearly working class, wearing worn work clothes. "My name is Carlos Morales. I own a small restaurant in the Bronx, been in my family for 30 years. During COVID, we got shut down, lost everything. I called Representative Ocasio-Cortez's office 8 times over 4 months asking for help understanding the PPP loan process, the relief programs, anything that could save my family's business." Carlos's voice broke slightly. "Nobody ever called back, not once. But I saw Representative Ocasio-Cortez on television at celebrity events, at the Met Gala, giving speeches about helping working people and small businesses. She had time for that but no time for me. My restaurant closed. 30 years of my family's work gone. Not because there wasn't help available, but because I couldn't navigate the programs alone, and my congresswoman was too busy being famous to answer my calls." He pulled out a photograph from his pocket, an old picture of a restaurant full of happy customers. This is what Representative Ocasio-Cortez's constituent service looks like. A closed business because she cared more about her brand than her job. Shapiro let that testimony stand without commentary, simply moved to his final section. Representative Ocasio-Cortez attacked me at the beginning of this hearing, called me a propagandist, a spreader of hatred, dangerous to democracy. She questioned my integrity and my character. So let me summarize what we've learned about her character, about her integrity, about who's actually dangerous. His delivery accelerated to maximum speed, each point a hammer blow. $6 million to her boyfriend for undefined work. $800,000 to her chief of staff's family company for services that produced worse results. $3 million in merchandise profits from selling anti-capitalist products. $2 million personal net worth accumulated in 6 years. 25,000 jobs killed for social media clout. 0 significant legislation passed. Green New Deal accomplishing nothing while she profits from talking about it. Worst constituent response rate in Congress, because helping actual people doesn't build her brand. Small businesses closing while she attends celebrity events. Working people losing opportunities while she gets rich attacking the system she's thriving in. Shapiro stood up, gathering his documents. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, you called me dangerous, but I'm a commentator expressing opinions. You're a member of Congress with actual power over people's lives, and you've abused that power to enrich yourself while abandoning the working people you claim to represent. Between the two of us, who's actually dangerous to democracy? The silence that followed was absolute. AOC sat at the witness table, unable to respond, unable to defend any of it because every fact Shapiro had presented was documented and verifiable. Her face had gone from confident to pale to stricken over the course of his testimony. The progressive gallery had largely emptied, her supporters unable to reconcile the reality being presented with the image they had believed in. The conservative gallery sat quiet, recognizing they were witnessing not just a political takedown, but a complete destruction of someone who had made the fatal mistake of attacking someone who came prepared with facts. Chairman Comer looked like he wanted to be anywhere else on earth. This hearing is adjourned, he managed, his gavel falling with a sound like a gunshot. AOC stood on shaky legs, her team of handlers immediately surrounding her, trying to shield her from the cameras that were capturing every moment of her humiliation. But there was no escaping what had just happened. Within minutes, the video would be uploaded to every platform, viewed millions of times, dissected and analyzed and shared. The phrase "facts don't care about your feelings" would trend worldwide. Her political career would never recover. She had attacked Ben Shapiro thinking she would humiliate him, destroy his credibility, cement her status as a fearless progressive warrior. Instead, she had given him the opportunity to systematically dismantle her entire public image using nothing but her own record, her own words, her own decisions. She had tried to fight facts with feelings, logic with emotion, substance with performance. And she had learned what millions already knew: facts always win. The aftermath of Ben Shapiro's testimony rippled through the chamber like an earthquake whose tremors would be felt for months, perhaps years. AOC remained standing at the witness table, her handlers forming a protective circle around her. But their body language betrayed their awareness that no amount of spin or damage control could undo what had just occurred. This wasn't a gaffe that could be walked back with a clarifying statement. This wasn't an out-of-context quote that could be explained away by friendly journalists. This was a comprehensive, documented, systematic destruction of her entire political brand, captured on camera from multiple angles, recorded for posterity, and already being uploaded to every social media platform in existence. Ben Shapiro gathered his materials with unhurried precision, carefully placing each document back into his folder in the reverse order of how he had presented them, a methodical process that somehow made the devastation he had just delivered even more complete. He wasn't gloating, wasn't celebrating, wasn't even acknowledging the conservative gallery's barely suppressed excitement at what they had witnessed. He was simply a professional who had completed a job, presented evidence, fulfilled his obligation to speak truth regardless of how uncomfortable that truth made people. As he stood to leave the witness table, he paused for just a moment, looking at AOC with an expression that wasn't triumph or contempt, but something closer to pity. He had not destroyed her out of personal animosity or political malice. He had simply responded to her attacks with facts, and those facts had proven more devastating than any personal insult could ever be. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, he said quietly, his rapid-fire delivery slowing to a measured pace that gave weight to each word, I didn't come here today to ruin your career. You did that yourself through your actions, your decisions, your choices about how to use the power that voters entrusted to you. Every fact I presented today came from public records, from your own financial disclosures, from your own tweets and statements. I didn't manufacture anything. I didn't distort anything. I simply held up a mirror and forced you to look at what you've actually done versus what you've claimed to represent. The difference between those two things, between your rhetoric and your reality, that's what destroyed you here today. Not me. You. He turned to leave, but then stopped and added one more thought, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent chamber. And for what it's worth, I hope you learn from this. I hope you understand that politics isn't performance art, that governing isn't the same as generating viral content, that the people you represent deserve more than a celebrity who occasionally votes on legislation between photo shoots and podcast appearances. You have real power over real lives. Use it responsibly, or get out of the way and let someone else do the job you're too busy being famous to actually perform. With that, Ben Shapiro walked out of the hearing room, leaving behind a political wreckage that would dominate news coverage for weeks and alter the trajectory of progressive politics for years to come. The media response to what became known simply as the Shapiro takedown began within minutes and built to a crescendo that drowned out almost every other political story for the following week. Conservative outlets, predictably, treated it as complete vindication of everything they had been saying about AOC since she first burst onto the national scene. Fox News ran segments analyzing every section of Shapiro's testimony, bringing in financial experts to verify his numbers, constitutional scholars to discuss the implications of her legislative failures, and former campaign workers to corroborate the stories of exploitation and hypocrisy. The Daily Wire, Shapiro's own media company, published the full transcript alongside supporting documents, creating a comprehensive archive that made it impossible for critics to claim anything had been taken out of context or misrepresented. But the more significant coverage came from sources that had previously been friendly to AOC, outlets that had helped build her brand and amplify her message, journalists who had treated her as a generational voice, rather than a politician who should be scrutinized like any other elected official. The cognitive dissonance was palpable as these outlets struggled to reconcile the progressive icon they had promoted with the documented evidence of corruption and incompetence that Shapiro had presented. The New York Times, which had published multiple puff pieces about AOC's meteoric rise and revolutionary potential, now ran a lengthy investigation into the campaign payments to Riley Roberts, reluctantly confirming that Shapiro's numbers were accurate and that no substantial work product could be identified to justify the $6 million in payments. The article was careful to include quotes from AOC's defenders, claiming that opposition research and digital strategy work often leaves no visible trail. But even those defenses sounded hollow when placed alongside the documented payments and the lack of any demonstrable results. The Washington Post, another outlet that had been largely sympathetic to AOC's brand of progressive politics, assigned a team of investigative reporters to examine the Amazon HQ2 situation and its aftermath. Their findings, published 3 weeks after the hearing, were damning in their thoroughness. The reporters interviewed dozens of Queens residents, small business owners who had been preparing to expand in anticipation of Amazon employees, union workers who had lost promised construction jobs, community leaders who had seen economic development plans collapse when the deal fell through. The picture that emerged was of a community that had been sacrificed for one politician's need to appear revolutionary, a neighborhood that had lost transformative economic opportunity because their congresswoman cared more about her social media presence than their actual welfare. The Post's reporting included interviews with AOC's own constituents who had voted for her but now felt betrayed, working-class families who had believed her rhetoric about fighting for them, but had seen no tangible benefits from her time in office. Even outlets like Vox and The Atlantic, bastions of progressive thought leadership that had championed AOC as the future of left-wing politics, found themselves forced to grapple with the contradictions Shapiro had exposed. Vox published a lengthy piece titled The Performance Problem: How Social Media Celebrity Corrupts Progressive Politics, which used AOC as a case study without naming her directly but making clear who the subject was. The article explored how the incentive structures of social media platforms rewarded viral moments and performative outrage over substantive policy work, how building a personal brand became more valuable than legislative accomplishment, how followers and engagement metrics replaced constituent service and bill passage as measures of political success. The Atlantic went even further, publishing an essay by a former AOC campaign volunteer who described the culture of exploitation within the campaign. The pressure on young staffers to work impossible hours for no pay while senior campaign officials and connected vendors collected millions. The gap between the campaign's public messaging about fighting corruption and its private practices of enriching insiders. The testimonies from Carlos Morales and Jennifer Ramirez, the small business owner whose restaurant had closed, and the campaign volunteer who had worked for free while Riley Roberts collected millions, became symbolic of something larger than just AOC's personal failings. They represented the betrayal that many working-class and young progressive voters felt when they compared the promises of revolutionary change with the reality of politicians who talked left while living like millionaires, who championed socialism while practicing capitalism, who claimed to fight the system while becoming wealthy from their position within it. Their stories were shared millions of times across social media, not by conservative activists trying to score political points, but by former AOC supporters who felt personally deceived, who had invested their time and money and hope into someone they thought was different only to discover she was just better at branding than traditional politicians. The political fallout extended far beyond AOC herself. The entire squad, the group of young progressive congresswomen who had entered office together and built a collective brand around revolutionary change and fighting the establishment, found themselves under renewed scrutiny. Reporters who had previously given them friendly coverage began asking harder questions about their legislative records, their campaign finances, their constituent services. Rashida Tlaib faced investigations into payments to family members for campaign work. Ilhan Omar's complex network of campaign consultants and vendors came under examination. Ayanna Pressley's legislative accomplishments, or lack thereof, became a topic of discussion. The protective shield that social media popularity and progressive credentials had provided began to crack as journalists recognized that celebrity politicians could no longer be treated as beyond criticism or immune from the same scrutiny applied to other elected officials. Within AOC's own district, the immediate political consequences were severe and probably irreversible. A coalition of community leaders, small business owners, and union representatives organized a town hall meeting to discuss their congresswoman's performance, and the gathering drew over 2,000 attendees, filling a Queens High School auditorium to capacity with overflow crowds watching on screens in adjacent rooms. The anger was palpable and genuine, not manufactured by political operatives, but arising organically from constituents who felt abandoned by someone who had promised to be their voice in Washington, but had instead used Washington as a platform for personal enrichment and celebrity. Speaker after speaker rose to detail examples of AOC's office failing to respond to constituent needs, ignoring requests for help with federal agencies, providing no assistance with immigration cases or veteran benefits or small business loans. The 6-week average response time that Shapiro had cited was confirmed by dozens of constituents who shared stories of calling her office repeatedly, leaving messages that were never returned, sending emails that disappeared into the void, while their congresswoman appeared on television and at celebrity events. The town hall culminated in the formation of a Accountability First Committee that would recruit and support a primary challenger for AOC's seat in the next election. The committee was deliberately bipartisan, including Democrats who had voted for AOC but felt betrayed, independents who had been attracted to her anti-establishment message but were repelled by her self-enrichment, even some Republicans from the district who recognized that defeating AOC in a Democratic primary was more realistic than winning the general election in a heavily blue district. Within 2 weeks of the committee's formation, 3 credible candidates had announced primary challenges, each emphasizing constituent service over celebrity, legislative accomplishment over social media presence, substance over performance. One challenger, a Latina community organizer who had worked in Queens for 20 years, released a campaign video that opened with her standing in front of the closed restaurant that had belonged to Carlos Morales, using his story as an example of what happens when politicians prioritize fame over function. The financial investigations that Shapiro's testimony sparked went far deeper than anyone had initially anticipated. The Federal Election Commission, responding to formal complaints filed by government watchdog organizations armed with Shapiro's documentation, launched an investigation into the payments to Riley Roberts and other AOC campaign vendors. The FEC's preliminary findings, leaked to the press 6 weeks after the hearing, indicated serious questions about whether the payments constituted personal use of campaign funds, which would be a federal crime carrying potential prison time. The commission referred the matter to the Department of Justice for potential criminal investigation, a rare escalation that signaled investigators believed they had found evidence of actual lawbreaking rather than just ethical violations or poor judgment. AOC's legal team, which had grown from 2 attorneys to a dozen, as the investigations multiplied, issued statements claiming everything had been done in accordance with campaign finance law, and that the payments represented legitimate services. But they notably failed to provide any documentation of what those services actually were or what work product justified millions in payments. The House Ethics Committee, previously reluctant to investigate one of its own members, especially one as popular with progressive activists as AOC, found itself under pressure from both parties to examine her conduct. Republican members had obvious political motivations, but even Democratic members recognized that failing to investigate credible allegations of campaign finance violations and self-dealing would make the party look complicit in corruption. The Ethics Committee voted to open a formal investigation, and their subpoenas for campaign records, contracts, and communications began arriving at AOC's office in steady waves. Each subpoena represented another aspect of her operation that would be subjected to forensic examination by investigators who were no longer willing to accept vague assurances that everything had been done properly. The investigation focused not just on the payments to Riley Roberts, but on the broader pattern of campaign spending, the relationships between AOC's office and various vendors, the overlap between her campaign activities and her personal brand building through books and media appearances. But perhaps the most personally devastating consequence for AOC was the collapse of her social media empire, the digital foundation that her entire political brand had been built upon. Within hours of Shapiro's testimony ending, her Twitter mentions became a nightmare of criticism, mockery, and demands for accountability. Former supporters, the young progressives who had defended her against every previous attack, now turned on her with the fury of believers who had discovered their faith was misplaced. They had overlooked previous controversies, dismissed earlier criticisms as partisan attacks, given her the benefit of doubt on questionable decisions. But Shapiro's documentation of the gap between her rhetoric and reality, presented with such methodical precision and supported by irrefutable evidence, shattered the illusion they had been maintaining. The attacks came not from right-wing trolls but from her own base, from the people who had propelled her to prominence and now felt personally betrayed by her hypocrisy. AOC's Instagram, which had been her most effective platform for building parasocial relationships with young supporters through casual videos and behind-the-scenes glimpses of congressional life, became a graveyard of disappointed comments. She posted a defensive video attempting to address the allegations, sitting in her expensive Navy Yard apartment that now looked less like a modest home and more like evidence of her disconnect from working-class constituents. She claimed that all campaign payments had been reviewed by lawyers, that Riley's work had been extensive and valuable even if it wasn't publicly visible, that attacking Amazon had been the right decision regardless of the job losses, that her social media presence helped amplify progressive messages that would otherwise be ignored. The video was her standard approach to controversy: personal, emotional, positioning herself as a victim of coordinated attacks by powerful interests who feared her effectiveness. But this time, it didn't work. The comments section filled with point-by-point rebuttals citing specific facts from Shapiro's testimony, with former volunteers sharing their own experiences of exploitation, with constituents detailing how her office had failed them. Within 48 hours, she deleted the video, an admission of defeat from someone whose political identity was built on never backing down. Her podcast, which had been a lucrative side project generating substantial income through sponsorships and advertising, hemorrhaged listeners and financial support. Companies that had been eager to associate their brands with AOC's youth appeal and progressive credentials now wanted nothing to do with the taint of corruption and incompetence that Shapiro's testimony had created. Within 3 weeks, every major sponsor had pulled their advertising, and the podcast ceased production entirely. Another revenue stream dried up by the exposure of her actual record versus her carefully curated image. Her book deals, both published works and projects in development, faced similar consequences. Her publisher announced that the second printing of her political memoir would be delayed indefinitely, while they reassessed market conditions, publishing industry code for admitting that nobody wanted to buy a book by someone whose credibility had been destroyed. The planned follow-up book, which was supposed to detail her vision for progressive change and was expected to generate another massive advance, was quietly canceled, the contract dissolved by mutual agreement once it became clear that Shapiro's testimony had made her toxic to the mainstream audience publishers needed to justify seven-figure advances. The collapse of AOC's media empire illustrated something profound about the nature of celebrity politics in the social media age. She had built a following based not on legislative accomplishment or policy expertise, but on personality, on her ability to generate viral moments, on her skill at crafting a narrative of herself as an authentic voice fighting corrupt systems. That narrative worked as long as it remained unexamined, as long as her supporters took her self-presentation at face value and dismissed critics as partisan haters. But once the narrative was systematically dismantled with documented evidence, once the gap between image and reality became undeniable, the entire structure collapsed with shocking speed. Celebrity built on performance rather than substance proved to be incredibly fragile when confronted with facts. The millions of followers, the cultural influence, the media coverage, all of it evaporated when people realized they had been following a carefully constructed brand rather than a genuine public servant. The impact on progressive politics more broadly was significant and complicated. On one hand, AOC's downfall vindicated critics who had been warning for years that social media celebrity was corrupting left-wing movements, that prioritizing viral content over substantive policy was a dead-end strategy, that building cults of personality around individual politicians was fundamentally incompatible with the collective action and institutional change that progressive goals required. These critics, who had often been dismissed as jealous or out of touch or insufficiently committed to the revolution, now found their warnings proven correct. On the other hand, AOC's failure created an opening for a different kind of progressive politics, one less focused on individual celebrity and more grounded in community organizing, legislative skill, and actual results. Younger politicians entering the movement learned from her mistakes, understanding that social media followers were not a substitute for constituent service, that performance activism needed to be backed by substantive work, that enriching yourself while preaching socialism would inevitably lead to exposure and downfall. 6 months after the Shapiro testimony, The political landscape had shifted in ways that would have seemed impossible before that hearing. AOC had effectively withdrawn from public life, making no media appearances, issuing no statements beyond what her lawyers required, focusing whatever political capital she had left on avoiding criminal prosecution rather than advancing any legislative agenda. Her office continued to function in a basic capacity, but her staff had turned over almost completely as talented aides fled to other members who might actually win re-election, leaving behind only the most loyal or least employable to maintain minimal operations. In her district, polling showed her approval rating had collapsed from the mid-60s to the low 30s, with over 60% of constituents saying they wanted someone new to represent them. The primary challengers who had announced in the wake of Shapiro's testimony had consolidated around a single candidate, that Latina community organizer who had used Carlos Morales's closed restaurant as a symbol of AOC's failures. And preliminary polls showed her leading AOC by double digits among likely Democratic primary voters. The broader squad had largely distanced themselves from AOC, recognizing that association with her had become politically toxic. They issued carefully worded statements expressing support for investigations into any legitimate allegations, while emphasizing their own records and constituent services, trying to create separation between their brands and hers. Some, like Ayanna Pressley, pivoted hard toward emphasizing legislative work and local issues, abandoning the national celebrity approach that had defined the squad's collective identity. Others, like Rashida Tlaib, doubled down on progressive ideology but made public efforts to demonstrate constituent responsiveness and transparency in campaign finances, learning from AOC's mistakes even as they maintained their political alliance with her. The squad as a unified force, as a brand representing a new generation of revolutionary progressive politics, effectively ceased to exist, replaced by individual members pursuing their own political survival strategies. Ben Shapiro, meanwhile, had leveraged the hearing into even greater prominence and influence. His testimony had been viewed over 100 million times across various platforms, becoming one of the most watched political videos in internet history. The Daily Wire's subscription numbers doubled in the 3 months following the hearing, as people who had dismissed Shapiro as just another partisan commentator recognized that he had been right about AOC all along and wanted to hear what else he had been right about. His speaking fees increased, his podcast listenership grew, his books shot up bestseller lists. But more significantly, he had demonstrated a template for holding progressive politicians accountable, for puncturing the protective bubble of social media celebrity with documented facts and systematic analysis. Other conservative commentators and journalists began following his model, investigating progressive politicians' actual records versus their rhetoric, documenting the gaps between what they promised and what they delivered, presenting evidence rather than just ideological opposition. The long-term impact of what became known as the Shapiro takedown would be debated by political scientists and commentators for years. Some argued that it represented a turning point where celebrity politics and social media fame became recognized as insufficient foundations for actual governance, where voters began demanding substance over style, where the media became more willing to scrutinize progressive politicians with the same intensity they applied to conservatives. Others contended that it was an isolated incident, that AOC had been uniquely vulnerable due to her specific hypocrisies, and that other celebrity politicians would learn to be more careful about enriching themselves while preaching socialism. Still others saw it as a cautionary tale about what happens when politicians attack someone without being prepared for them to respond with documented evidence, when performance activism meets actual accountability. For Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez herself, the hearing represented not just a career setback but a complete unraveling of everything she had built. She had arrived in Congress as a revolutionary, a voice for a generation, proof that the system could be changed from within. She had leveraged social media better than any politician of her era, built a following that rivaled major media outlets, created a brand that made her one of the most recognized politicians in America despite passing no significant legislation. She had become wealthy and famous and influential, had seemed unstoppable in her rise. And then she had made the fatal mistake of attacking Ben Shapiro without being prepared for him to respond with facts. In the space of 42 minutes, everything she had built collapsed, her hypocrisy exposed, her incompetence documented, her brand destroyed by reality. She had tried to fight facts with feelings, logic with emotion, substance with performance. And she had learned what millions of people already knew, what Shapiro had been saying for years. Facts don't care about your feelings. Reality doesn't care about your narrative. Truth doesn't care about your brand. And eventually, inevitably, the gap between what you claim to be and what you actually are becomes impossible to hide. The final act of the AOC story, at least as it existed at that moment in political history, came 13 months after the Shapiro hearing. The Democratic primary for her congressional seat took place on a humid June evening, with turnout that broke records for a primary election in her district. The results were decisive and brutal. The community organizer challenger won with 57% of the vote in a three-way race, while AOC finished third with just 18%, even losing to a lesser-known candidate who had entered the race late. In her concession speech, delivered to a sparse crowd of remaining loyalists in a modest Queens community center that stood in stark contrast to the celebrity-filled victory parties of her previous campaigns, AOC was uncharacteristically subdued. She thanked her supporters, acknowledged that voters had made their choice, and promised to continue fighting for progressive causes in whatever capacity the future held. But the fire was gone, the confidence extinguished, the revolutionary rhetoric replaced by the deflated tone of someone who had been thoroughly defeated not by partisan opposition, but by her own constituents who had given her a chance and watched her squander it. As she left the stage for the final time as a sitting member of Congress, as cameras captured her departure for what everyone knew would be the last significant media coverage of her political career, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez looked less like a revolutionary fighter and more like what she had perhaps always been beneath the carefully constructed brand. A young woman who had been good at social media, skilled at performance, talented at self-promotion, but ultimately unprepared for and uninterested in the actual work of governance. She had wanted to be famous more than she wanted to be effective, had prioritized building her brand over serving her constituents, had enriched herself while preaching socialism, and had ultimately been held accountable by the very people she claimed to represent. The voters had given her power, and she had used it to make herself wealthy and famous. Now the voters had taken that power back, and she was left with nothing but the memory of what might have been if she had chosen substance over celebrity, service over self-promotion, reality over performance. If this story resonated with you, if you believe that accountability matters regardless of political party, if you think politicians should be held responsible for the gap between their rhetoric and their reality, then I need you to do something right now. Hit that subscribe button, smash the like button, and share this video with everyone who needs to understand that performance politics eventually meets reality. Because what you just witnessed wasn't a partisan attack, it was accountability through facts. Drop a comment telling me which politician you want to see held accountable next, because we're not stopping. This is just the beginning. Subscribe, like, share, and let's demand that our leaders actually live up to the values they claim to represent.